Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this channel, I deal with responses to the skeptical worldview, Christian responses to the skeptical worldview. Currently, I'm going through the book I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, written by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. I believe it was published in 2004. These are the contents of that book. Several chapters have been covered in this book so far. I believe we've covered the first half of it in previous videos. If you have found value in my work, please consider supporting my ministry by purchasing my published work. The title of the book is called Pinnacles and Plateaus. It's the first volume. It deals with the first 30 chapters of the book of Psalms. It's an expositional devotional commentary where I go verse by verse through the first 30 chapters of the book of Psalms. It's available where books are sold. The publisher is Zulon Press. Chapter 9 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek is, Do We Have Early Testimony About Jesus? So we're going to deal with the gospel according to non-Christians. In AD 66, Jews in Palestine initiated a revolt against Roman rule that, to put it mildly, the Romans did not appreciate. The emperor sent troops led by General Titus Vespasian, to squash the rebellion and regain control of rebel areas. In 86, Vespasian laid siege to the rebel town of Jotapata in Galilee. In the 47th day of the siege, a young Jewish revolutionary chose to surrender to the superior Roman army rather than to commit suicide, a fate many of his countrymen had chosen. That young man won favor with Vespasian and was later taken to Rome by General Titus, Vespasian's son, and Titus destroyed Jerusalem and the Jewish temple in AD 70. That young man was Flavius Josephus, who ultimately became the greatest Jewish historian of all time. Josephus began his historical writings in Rome while serving as a historian for the Roman Emperor Domitian. It was there that he authored his autobiography and two major historical works. One of those works is his now famous Antiquities of the Jews, which Josephus finished in AD 93. In Book 18, Chapter 3, Section 3 of Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus, who was not a Christian, wrote these words. At this time, the time of Pontius Pilate, there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, but those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. This was not Josephus' only mention of Jesus. In another passage from Antiquities, Josephus revealed how the new high priest of the Jews, Ananus the Younger, took advantage of a gap in Roman rule to kill James, the brother of Jesus. It was AD 62, and the Roman governor Festus suddenly died in office. 3 months elapsed before his successor Albinus could get to Judea, allowing ample time for Ananus to do his dirty work. Josephus describes the incident this way. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he, Ananus the high priest, assembled the Sanhedrin of the judges, and brought before them the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. So here we have not only another first century reference to Jesus, but confirmation that he had a brother named James who obviously was not well liked by the Jewish authorities. Could it be that James was martyred because he was the leader of the Jerusalem church, as the New Testament implies? Just how many non-Christian sources are there that mention Jesus? Including Josephus, there are 10 known non-Christian writers who mention Jesus within 150 years of Jesus' life. By contrast, over the same 150 years, there are 9 non-Christian sources who mention Tiberius Caesar, the Roman emperor at the time of Jesus. So, discounting all the Christian sources, Jesus is actually mentioned by more by one more source than the Roman emperor. If you include the Christian sources, authors mentioning Jesus outnumber those mentioning Tiberius 43-10. Some of these non-Christian sources, such as Celsus, Tacitus, and the Jewish Talmud, could be considered anti-Christian sources. While these works do not have any eyewitness testimony that contradicts events described in the New Testament documents, they are works written by writers whose tone is decidedly anti-Christian. What can we learn from them and more neutral non-Christian sources? We learned that they admit certain facts about early Christianity that help us piece together a storyline that is surprisingly congruent with the New Testament. Piecing together all 10 non-Christian references, we see that Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. Jesus lived a virtuous life. Jesus was a wonder worker. Jesus had a brother named James. Jesus was acclaimed to be the Messiah. Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Jesus was crucified on the eve of the Jewish Passover. Darkness and an earthquake occurred when Jesus died. Jesus' disciples believed that Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus' disciples were willing to die for their belief that Jesus had died and risen from the dead. Christianity spread rapidly as far as Rome. Jesus' disciples denied the Roman gods and worshiped Jesus as God. In light of the 12 above facts from non-Christian, in light of the above non-Christian references, the theory that Jesus never existed is clearly unreasonable. How could non-Christian writers collectively reveal a storyline congruent with the New Testament if Jesus never existed? But the implications run even deeper than that. What does this say about the New Testament? On the face of it, non-Christian sources affirm the New Testament. While the non-Christian authors don't say they believe in the resurrection, the non-Christian sources do report that the disciples certainly believed it. Since, as we've shown, the existence of God and the possibility of miracles is firmly established through natural revelation, and the general story of Christ in the early church is affirmed through Christian sources, did the miracles of Christ actually occur as the disciples claim? Do the New Testament documents record actual history? Could it be that they are not biased religious writings full of myths and fables, as many in our modern world assume, but instead describe events that actually occurred about 2,000 years ago? If so, we'll be well on our way to discovering which theistic religion is true. So is the New Testament history? To see if the New Testament is a record of actual history, we need to answer two questions concerning the documents that comprise the New Testament. Question number 1. Do we have accurate copies of the original documents that were written down in the first century? Question number 2. Do those documents speak the truth? In order to believe the New Testament message, both of those questions must be answered in the affirmative. It's not enough to just give evidence that we have an accurate copy of the original first century documents, which is question number 1, because those documents could be telling lies. We must have an accurate copy of the documents and have reason to believe that those documents describe what really happened nearly 2,000 years ago, which is question number 2. Let's begin with question number 1. Do we have an accurate copy? We're sure you remember we're sure that you remember the child's game of telephone. That's where one child's given a verbal message to pass to the next child, who passes what he's heard on to the next child, and so on. By the time the message gets to the last child in the chain, it barely resembles what the first kid was told. To the casual observer, it seems like that same type of distortion could infect documents that have been transmitted from generation to generation over 2,000 years. So by the game of telephone, by the premise of the game of telephone, by the same logic, the documents get messed up in transmission. I've heard Bart Ehrman make this kind of argument. Fortunately, the New Testament, here's the response to Bart Ehrman's critique. Fortunately, the New Testament was not transmitted this way. Since it was not told to one person who told it to another, and so on and so on, the problem from the telephone game does not apply. There's the answer to Bart Ehrman's critique right there. The telephone game does not apply. Numerous people independently witnessed New Testament events. Many of them committed it to memory, and 9 of those eyewitness contemporaries put their observations in writing. At this point, we need to clear up a common misunderstanding about the New Testament. When we speak about the New Testament documents, we're not talking about one writing, but about 27 writings. Now, that's interesting to think about. I hear a skeptical objection that Christianity is based on the writings in one book, but Muslims have their book, and Mormons have their book. How do you know which book to believe? Well, this is a very key answer to that objection. That specific objection is that we're not talking about one book. We're talking about 27 different writings that all tell one unified story. We can deal with the contradictions, quote unquote contradictions, another time, but we're talking about 27 different writings that tell the same basic story, a unified story. The New Testament documents are 27 different documents written on 27 different scrolls by 9 different writers over a 20 to 50 year period. These individual writings have since been collected into one book we now call the Bible. So the New Testament is not just one source, but a collection of sources. There's only one problem. So far, none of the original written documents of the New Testament have been discovered. We have only copies of the original writings called manuscripts. Will this prevent us from knowing what the original said? Not at all. And Bart Ehrman is quick to say, yeah, we don't have the originals, we have copies of copies, and the copies were copied incorrectly, and they contain lots of errors and lots of mistakes. But even he will admit that many of the quote-unquote errors do not change, most of the errors do not change the meaning of text significantly. Okay, so will the fact that we have copies prevent us from knowing what the original said? Not at all. In fact, all significant literature from the ancient world is reconstructed into its original form by comparing manuscripts that survive. To reconstruct the original, it helps to have a large number of manuscripts that are written not long after the original. More manuscripts and earlier manuscripts usually provide more trustworthy testimony and enable a more accurate reconstruction. How do the New Testament documents fare in this regard? Extremely well, and far better than anything else from the ancient world. In fact, the New Testament documents have more manuscripts, earlier manuscripts, and more abundantly supported manuscripts than the best 10 pieces of classical literature combined. Some time ago, I listened to a debate between Bart Ehrman and a Christian scholar. The debate was Ehrman obviously taking the skeptic view that about the accuracy of the New Testament manuscripts, and I forget the name of the Christian right now off the top of my head, but he was taking the view that the New Testament manuscripts can be trusted. And one of the frequently made points was that the New Testament contains, just like this says, more manuscripts. He was basically making this point. In fact, the New Testament documents have more manuscripts, earlier manuscripts, and more abundantly supported manuscripts than the best 10 pieces of classical literature combined. Here's what we mean. So 25 years between the original and first surviving copies of the New Testament manuscripts. In contrast, the first surviving manuscripts of Homer were 500 years after the originals. For Demosthenes, 1,400 years. First surviving after the originals. For Herodotus, 1,400 years. For Plato, 1,200 years. Tacitus, 1,000 years. Caesar, 1,000 years. Pliny, 750 years. So the New Testament documents are earlier. So 25 years after they were penned, the first copies were the copies were 25 years after they were original. The number of manuscript copies. So the New Testament contains more manuscripts than all of these. You can see that the New Testament contains the greater manuscript amount than Homer, Demosthenes, Herodotus, Plato, Tacitus, and Caesar. The New Testament documents are earlier than all the others. That's the point. At last count, there are nearly 5,700. Again, this book was published 2004. Last count, there are nearly 5,700 handwritten Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. In addition, there are more than 9,000 manuscripts in other languages, like Syriac, Coptic, Latin, and Arabic. Some of these nearly 15,000 manuscripts, that's adding the 9,000 to the 5,700, that's where they get nearly 15,000, are complete Bibles. Others are books or pages, and quite a few, and a few are just fragments. There's nothing from the ancient world that even comes close in terms of manuscript volume. The next closest work is the Iliad by Homer with 643 manuscripts, 643 versus 15,000. Most other ancient works survive on fewer than a dozen manuscripts, yet few historians question the historicity of the events contained in those works. Why? Because if we can put enough doubt in people's mind about the accuracy of the Bible, then we can get people to disbelieve the Bible, and then people can live however they want because they don't feel compelled to be accountable to the Creator God. But you can ignore that all you want. There's going to come a day when, despite all your objections, you're going to have to answer to him. So not only does the New Testament enjoy abundant manuscript support, but it also has manuscripts that were written soon after the originals. The earliest undisputed manuscript is a segment from John chapter 18, known as the John Rylands Fragment, because it's housed in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, England. Scholars date the John Rylands Fragment to be between AD 117 and 138, but some say it's even earlier than that. It was found in Egypt, across the Mediterranean from its probable place of composition from where it was written in Asia Minor, demonstrating that John's Gospel was copied and had spread quite some distance from by the early 2nd century. Even earlier than the John Rylands fragment are 9 disputed fragments that date from AD 50 to AD 80, found with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some scholars believe that these fragments are parts of 6 New Testament books, including Mark, Acts, Romans, 1 Timothy, 2 Peter, and James. While other scholars resist this conclusion, perhaps because its admission would undermine their liberal teachings that the New Testament was written later, they've not found any other New Testament text that these fragments could be. Fragments were found in a cave that had previously been identified as containing material from 50 BC to AD 50. The scholars who first identified these early fragments as New Testament books, was Jose O'Callahan, a noted Spanish paleographer. The New York Times recognized the implications of O'Callahan's theory by admitting that if it is true, it would prove at least one of the Gospels, St. Mark's Gospel, was written only a few years after the death of Jesus. But even if they are not true New Testament fragments, and the John Rylands fragment really is the earliest, the time gap between the original and the first surviving copy is still vastly shorter than anything else from the ancient world. The Iliad has the next shortest gap at about 500 years. Most other ancient works are 1,000 years or more from the originals. The New Testament gap is about 25 years and maybe less. So that was what that table was trying to show, that the gap, the time gap between the original and the first surviving copy, 25 years, maybe less. This does not mean that there were no other manuscripts between the original and the first copy. There most certainly were. It simply means that those manuscripts have decayed, have been destroyed, or are still undiscovered. How old are the oldest surviving manuscripts of complete New Testament books? Manuscripts that are complete New Testament books survive from about 8,200. How about the oldest manuscripts of the entire New Testament? Most of the New Testament, including all the Gospels, survives from 250, and the manuscript of the entire New Testament, including a Greek Old Testament called the Codex Vaticanus, survives from about 325. Several other complete manuscripts survive from that century, and those manuscripts have spelling and punctuation characteristics that suggest that they are in a family of manuscripts that can be traced back to AD 100 to 150. If these numerous and early manuscripts were all scholars had, they could not reconstruct the original New Testament with great accuracy. But they also have abundant supporting evidence from the ancient world that makes New Testament construction even more certain. Let's look at that next. Okay, so there are more abundantly supported manuscripts. Beginning in February of AD 303, the Roman Emperor Diocletian ordered 3 edicts of persecution upon Christians because Diocletian believed that the existence of Christianity was breaking the covenant between Rome and Rome's gods. The edicts called for the destruction of churches, manuscripts, and books, and the killing of Christians. Hundreds, if not thousands, of manuscripts were destroyed across the Roman Empire during this persecution, which lasted until AD 311. But even if Diocletian had succeeded in wiping every biblical manuscript off the face of the earth, he could not have destroyed our ability to reconstruct the New Testament. Why? Because the early Christian fathers, men of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, such as Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, and others, quoted the New Testament so much. 36,289 times to be exact. That all but 11 verses of the New Testament can be reconstructed just from quotations by Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, and others. So those church fathers have quoted all but 11 verses of the New Testament. In other words, you could go down to your local public library, check out their works, and read nearly the entire New Testament just from their quotations of it. So we not only have thousands of manuscripts, but thousands of quotations from those manuscripts. This makes reconstruction of the original text virtually certain. But how certain? How are the originals reconstructed, and how accurate is this reconstructed New Testament? How is the original reconstructed? These 3 facts, many early and supported manuscripts, early manuscripts, and supported manuscripts, help scholars reconstruct the original New Testament manuscripts rather easily. The process of comparing the many copies and quotations allows an extremely accurate reconstruction of the original, even if errors were made during copying. How does this work? Consider the following example. Suppose we have 4 different manuscripts that have 4 different errors in the same verse, such as Philippians 4:13, which says, "I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength." Here are the hypothetical copies. They're just putting the pound sign in different places in the word things. Is there any mystery in what the original said? Of course not. By the process of comparing and cross-checking, the original New Testament can be reconstructed with great accuracy. And the reconstruction of the New Testament is easier than this because there are far fewer errors in the actual New Testament manuscripts than are represented by this example. Let's assume for a minute that the New Testament really is the Word of God. Skeptics may ask, well, if the New Testament really is the Word of God, then why didn't God preserve the original? We can only speculate here, but one possibility is because His Word might be better protected through copies than through original documents. That makes sense. How so? Because if the originals were in someone's possession, that person could change it. If there were copies spread all over the ancient world, there's no way one scribe or priest could alter it. As we've seen, the process of reconstruction allows variants and changes from the copies to be identified and corrected rather easily. So, ironically, not having the originals may preserve God's Word better than having the originals. How accurate is the reconstruction? In order to address the issue of accuracy, we need to clear up misunderstandings many critics have concerning errors in biblical manuscripts. Ehrman makes this a big issue. Some have estimated that there are about 200,000 errors in the New Testament manuscripts. First of all, these are not errors but variant readings, the vast majority of which are grammatical, which are just punctuation and spelling. Second, these readings are spread throughout nearly 5,700 manuscripts, so that a variant spelling of one letter of one word in one verse in 2,000 manuscripts is counted as 2,000 errors. But really it's just one. Textual scholars Westcott and Hort estimated that only 1 in 60 of these variants has significance. So this would leave a text that's 98.33% pure. Pretty pure. Philip Schaff calculated that of the 150,000 variants known in his day, only 400 changed the meaning of the passage. Only 50 were of real significance, and not even one affected an article of faith or precept of duty which is not abundantly sustained by other and undoubted passages or by the whole tenor of the scripture teaching. No other ancient book is so well authenticated. The great New Testament scholar and Princeton professor Bruce Metzger estimated that the Mahabharata of Hinduism is copied with only about 90% accuracy, and Homer's Iliad with about 95% accuracy. By comparison, Metzger estimated that the New Testament is about 99.5% accurate. Again, the 0.5% in question does not affect a single doctrine of the Christian faith. Another manuscript authority, Frederick Kenyon, summed up well the status of the New Testament when Kenyon wrote, quote, It cannot be too strongly asserted that in substance, the text of the Bible is certain. Especially is this the case with the New Testament. The number of manuscripts of the New Testament, of early translations from it, and of quotations from it in the oldest writers of the Church is so large that it is practically certain that the true reading of every doubtful passage is preserved in some one or another of these ancient authorities. This can be said of no other ancient book in the world, end quote. So we know that we have the same New Testament that was written down nearly 2,000 years ago. But the next question is even more important. Do we have an accurate copy of the truth, or do we have a lie? In other words, is the New Testament historically reliable? When we ask the question, is the New Testament historically reliable, we're seeking to discover if the major events described in the New Testament documents really happened. Specifically, was there really a Jewish man nearly 20,000 years ago? Excuse me, that's a typo. Was there really a Jewish man nearly 2,000 years ago by the name of Jesus, 2,000 years ago by the name of Jesus, who taught profound truths nearly 2,000 years ago, who performed miracles, who was crucified by Roman and Jewish authorities for claiming to be God, and who appeared to many witnesses after rising from the dead 3 days later after his death nearly 2,000 years ago? It is important to keep in mind that at this point, we're not seeking to discover if the New Testament is without error or if the New Testament is the Word of God. We're simply trying to discover if the basic storyline is in fact not fiction. We're trying to discover if the basic storyline of the New Testament is fact and is not fiction. In order to discover if the New Testament is fact, we need to ascertain what kinds of records comprise the New Testament. Are they documents written soon after the events by eyewitnesses, or by those who were interviewed by the eyewitnesses, or are they documents written much later by biased followers who simply embellish details about the life of a real historical figure? This is what skeptics will claim, that the Bible is just they're just documents written much later by biased followers who simply embellish details about the life of a real historical figure. Because the skeptics won't even dispute that Jesus was a real historical figure. They'll admit that. They're just going to remove their supernatural references in order to find out whether the claims about Jesus are true, as presented in the New Testament texts. In order to find out whether the New Testament is historically reliable, over the next few chapters we'll test the New Testament documents by criteria historians often use to determine whether or not to believe a given historical document. We'll refer to these criteria as historical tests. The historical tests include: do we have early testimony? Generally, the earlier the sources, the more accurate the testimony. Do we have eyewitness testimony? Eyewitness testimony is usually the best means of establishing what really happened. Do we have testimony from multiple independent eyewitness sources? Multiple independent eyewitnesses confirm the events that really occurred. They're not fiction. And they provide additional details that a single source might miss. True independent sources normally tell the same basic story but with differing details, and you have that in the Gospels. Bart Ehrman makes a big deal about the differing details. But As this says, these are true independent sources, and they are telling the same basic story, and yes, some of the details do differ. Historians sometimes call this coherence with dissimilarity. Number 4, are the eyewitnesses trustworthy? Should you believe the eyewitnesses? The character of the witnesses matters. Number 5, do we have corroborating evidence from archaeology or other writers? This adds further confirmation. Number 6, do we have enemy attestation? If opponents of the eyewitnesses admit certain facts that the eyewitnesses say are true, then those facts are probably true. For example, if your mother says you are brave, that might be true, but it's probably more credible if your archenemy says the same thing. In fact, in this very book, there's in a previous video when I was going through the evidence for the resurrection, I took content from this book and on the evidence for the resurrection. There's a whole chapter in this book that's devoted to the evidence for the resurrection, and that chapter begins with I believe it's 10 facts by Gary that are quoted by Gary Habermas as indisputable facts that even skeptics will grant. And so those are 10 facts that the archenemy of Christians, the skeptic, will grant. So that's enemy attestation. Okay, does the testimony contain evidence or contain events or details that are embarrassing to the authors? Yes, Frank Chruch talks a lot about embarrassing details. Since most people do not like to record negative information about themselves, any testimony that makes the author look bad is probably true, right? And Frank Chruch's he talks a lot about that in his talks. And you have the disciples acting. They went into hiding. The disciples went into hiding after the resurrection. The disciples didn't believe. These are things like these are examples of the embarrassing details. Doubting Thomas, that he's not going to believe unless Jesus comes and puts his hand in his side, and unless he can put his hand in Jesus' side, that would be an example of an embarrassing detail. In most cases, documents that meet most or all of these historical tests are considered to be trustworthy beyond a reasonable doubt. So if the document passes these 7 tests, then the document is considered trustworthy beyond a reasonable doubt. So how do the New Testament documents fare? We'll find out over this chapter and the next 3 chapters. But before we start at historical test number 1, do we have early testimony? We need to clear away for some objections that prevents many skeptics from even considering the reliability of the New Testament. So, is the New Testament historically reliable? Common objections to reliability. Objection number 1, history cannot be known. The most recent argument generated against even considering the reliability of the New Testament documents is the assertion that history cannot be known. Ironically, this objection normally comes from the same people who say that they know, this is so ironic, that evolutionists will say that they know that atheistic evolutionists will say they know that the first life generated spontaneously from non-living chemicals, and that all subsequent life evolved from that first life without intelligent intervention. They're going to say they know that based on evidence that they say that they have, which previously we discussed how that evidence is flawed at best. They're going to say they know about the first life, but then they're going to say the history can't be known. So they're contradicting themselves by saying history can't be known. But anyway, they're absolutely sure about evolutionary history, despite the fact that there's no eyewitnesses to the first evolution taking place, or there's no corroborating data for those events. Yet, they assert that the resurrection of Jesus Christ, an event for which there are eyewitnesses and corroborating data, cannot be known. The assertion that history cannot be known is against all common sense. Are we not sure that George Washington was the first president of the United States? There are no living people to verify those facts now, but we don't argue about that. are we sure that are we not sure that that Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president, that he gave the Gettysburg Address? Yet there are no living eyewitnesses to corroborate that data. Are we not sure that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941? But there probably are not any longer any eyewitnesses to that event. Are we not sure that the New York Mets won the 1969 World Series? How do we know these things? Because people wrote about them. But we're sure about those things. So the skeptic claim that history cannot be known is wrong. We can know history, and we do know history. In fact, if we can't know history, then we could never detect historical revisionism or historical propaganda, both of which assume that there's an objective history that can be known. Why can't someone have knowledge of a past event? The skeptic may say that someone can't have knowledge of a past event because you don't have access to all the facts. Well, then we can just say, so then scientists can't know anything either because they don't have access to all the facts. Obviously, this is absurd. Well, we don't have access to all the facts. We may be able to gather enough of the facts to be reasonably certain about what happened. Part of the confusion involves a failure to define what it means to know something. Since we can't go back in time and witness historical events again, our historical knowledge is based on probability. In other words, we use the same standard a jury uses to determine if a defendant committed a crime, beyond a reasonable doubt. Anybody who knows anything about contemporary apologetics knows the name J. Warner Wallace. He was a former cold case detective who has a ministry where he uses his skills as a cold case detective. He was a former atheist, and he uses his skills as a cold case detective to study the evidence for Christianity. And he was a former atheist and became a Christian by studying the evidence for Christianity using his cold case detective techniques. And this is what we're talking about here. You can't go back, because he would say that the crime that he would have to investigate as a cold case detective, there were no living witnesses. All the evidence is based on it's circumstantial, basically, because there's no eyewitness testimony. So he couldn't go back and witness the crime again. So he would have to go back and examine the evidence and come to the conclusion based on probability. And so that was what he did. So if history cannot be known, no jury could ever reach a verdict in a criminal case. After all, a jury makes a judgment about the guilt or innocence of someone based on knowledge of some past event. Historians must discover past events just like police and forensic scientists like J. Warner Wallace do by piecing together, well, he was a forensic investigator, by cold case detective, by piecing together evidence and interviewing eyewitnesses. Of course, he couldn't interview eyewitnesses because most of them were dead. But historians must discover past events by, like police and forensic scientists do, by piecing together evidence and interviewing eyewitnesses. And when they do, police and forensic scientists use 7 historical tests we've just identified above. Finally, if we cannot know history, skeptics cannot claim that Christianity is untrue. To say that Christianity is untrue, the skeptic must know history. Why? Because the very negation implies an affirmation. To say that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, the skeptic must know what actually did happen to him. In the end, the skeptics are caught in a dilemma. If they say history cannot be known, then they lose the ability to say that evolution is true and that Christianity is false. If they admit that history can be known, they must deal with multiple lines of historical evidence for creation and Christianity, some of which we've discussed in previous chapters of this book. Okay, the New Testament documents contain miracles. That's another objection. Skeptics usually charge that the New Testament contains miracles, therefore much of it has to be a legend. We've already answered that objection. Since God exists, we live in a theistic universe, therefore miracles are possible. And as we'll see in chapter 13, the events of the New Testament are in a context where miracles are not only possible, but were predicted. So, the inclusion of miracles does not negate the historicity of the New Testament documents, but may actually strengthen their historicity because they record predicted events. Okay, so the next objection is that the New Testament writers were biased. The great skeptic David Hume said witnesses should be unbiased if we're going to consider them to be credible. So, when skeptics look at the New Testament documents, skeptics often ask, how can you say that the New Testament documents are reliable when they were written by the converted? These biased accounts were written by biased people. It's true that the New Testament writers were biased and were converted people, but that doesn't mean that they lied or exaggerated. Indeed, their conversion and bias may have actually driven them to be more accurate. Let's see why. A few years ago, a so-called documentary about Jesus on a cable TV channel led off with the comment from the narrator. Quote, most of what we think we know about Jesus comes from the New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but we can't trust those books for accurate information because they were written by the converted, end quote. Now what's wrong with that logic? What's wrong with that logic is that it fails to ask the most important question. Why were they converted? Indeed, the first and most important question is not what were the beliefs of the New Testament writers. The first and most important question is why did they convert, yet why were they unconverted? Why did they convert from unconverted and become converted to Christianity? In other words, why did the New Testament writers suddenly abandon their livelihoods and treasured religious traditions for these new beliefs? They started unconverted and they became converted. Chruch posed that question to a couple of black Muslims during a radio debate. Like traditional Muslims, black Muslims do not believe that Jesus went to the cross, so there's no way he could have resurrected. With this in mind, Chruch asked the Muslims, why did the New Testament writers suddenly convert from Judaism to believing that Jesus rose from the dead? And one of them said, because they wanted power over the people. Chruch responded to that baseless claim by saying, what power did the New Testament writers gain by asserting that Jesus rose from the dead? The answer is none. In fact, instead of gaining power, they got exactly the opposite. Instead of gaining power, they got submission. Instead of gaining power, they got servitude. Instead of gaining power, they got persecution. Instead of gaining power, they got torture. And instead of gaining power, they got death. The Muslims had no answer to that response by Chruch. Chruch then asked the Muslims the question in a different way. What possible motive did the New Testament writers have to make up the resurrection if the resurrection was not true? Again, the people that Chruch was talking to had no response. Why? Because they realized that the New Testament writers had every earthly motive to deny the resurrection rather than proclaim it. There was no answer or incentive to make up the New Testament storyline. The last time we checked, the promise of submission, servitude, persecution, torture, and death would not motivate anyone to make up such a story. The New Testament writers certainly had no reason to make up a new religion. We must remember that all of them, with the possible exception of Luke, were Jews who firmly believed they already had the one true religion, and that nearly 2,000-year-old religion asserted that they, the Jews, were the chosen people of God. Why would the Jews who converted to Christianity risk persecution, death, and perhaps eternal damnation to start something that wasn't true and that elevated non-Jews into the exclusive relationship they claimed to have with the creator of the universe? Unless the resurrection really happened, why would they almost immediately stop observing the Sabbath, stop observing circumcision, stop observing the law of Moses, stop observing the centrality of the temple, stop the priestly system, and stop other Old Testament teachings? The New Testament writers had to have witnessed some very strong evidence to turn away from these ancient beliefs and practices that had defined who they and their forebears were for nearly 2,000 years. Okay, the next objection to reliability is that converted people are not objective. At this point, the skeptic might protest, but since the New Testament writers were converted, they cannot be objective. That's nonsense. People can be objective even when they aren't neutral. A doctor can find an objective diagnosis even if he has strong feelings for the patient. That is, he can be objective though he isn't neutral. In fact, His passion for the patient may cause him to be all the more diligent in diagnosing and then treating the disease properly. In writing this book, while certainly not neutral, the authors are presenting objective facts. Likewise, atheists are not neutral, but they too can present objective facts if they decide to. The New Testament writers could do the same. The truth of the matter is that all books are written for a reason, and most authors believe what they are writing. But that doesn't mean what they write is wrong or has no objective element. The Holocaust survivors who wrote down their experiences certainly were not neutral bystanders. They believed passionately in recording those events so that the world would never forget the Holocaust and hopefully never repeat it. While passion may cause some people to exaggerate, it may drive others to be all the more meticulous and accurate so as not to lose credibility and acceptance of the message they wish to communicate. This distinction between the neutrality and the objectivity of the New Testament is an extremely important point. Too often, the documents that make up the New Testament are automatically considered to be biased and untrustworthy. This is ironic because those who hold this view are often biased themselves. They're biased because they have not first investigated the New Testament documents or the context in which they were written in order to make an educated assessment of their trustworthiness. As we're about to see, the New Testament documents are not church propaganda or a monolith of writings designed to promote some church-manufactured theology. What are the New Testament documents, then? That's the question we'll address in the remainder of this chapter and the next 3 chapters. So let's get started. Okay, so converted people are not objective. We know we have an accurate copy of what was written down by the New Testament writers, but are those documents trustworthy? Our first question deals with historical test number 1. Are the New Testament documents early? As the table on this slide shows, in letters between AD 95 and 110, 3 early church fathers, Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp, quoted passages out of 25 of the 27 books of the New Testament. Only the short books of Jude and 2 John were not referenced, but they certainly had been written. Jude had written his short letter by this time because, being Jesus' half-brother, he was almost certainly dead by AD 100, and 2 John had been written because it came before 3 John, which was one of the 25 books quoted. Since Clement was in Rome and Ignatius and Polycarp were hundreds of miles away in Smyrna, the original New Testament documents had to have been written significantly earlier, otherwise they could not have circulated across the ancient world by that time. Therefore, it's safe to say that all the New Testament was written, and at least those in half, Therefore, it's safe to say that all the New Testament was written by AD 100, and at least half those in the left column several years before 95. But that's just the latest they could have been written. Most were probably written much earlier. How much earlier? Most, if not all, before 70. So most, if not all, these books were written before 70. About 40 years after the death of Jesus. Imagine this. You're a devout Jew in the 1st century. The center of your national, economic, and religious life is in Jerusalem, and especially the temple. It's been that way in your nation, your family, and almost every Jew's life for 1,000 years, ever since Solomon built the first temple. Most of the newest temple, constructed by King Herod, was completed when you were a child, but portions of it are still under construction and have been since 19 BC. For your entire life, you've attended services and brought sacrifices there to atone for the sins you've committed against God. Why? Because you and your countrymen consider this temple the earthly dwelling place of God, of the God of the universe, the maker of heaven and earth, the very deity whose name is so holy you dare not utter it. As a young man, you begin to follow a Jew named Jesus, who claims to be the long-awaited Messiah predicted in your scriptures. He performs miracles, teaches profound truths, and scolds and befuddles the priests in charge of the temple. Incredibly, he predicts his own death and resurrection. He also predicts that the temple itself will be destroyed before your generation passes away, as he did in the name of the sermon, the Olivet Discourse. This is scandalous. Jesus is convicted of blasphemy by your temple priests and is crucified on the eve of Passover, one of your holiest days. He's buried in a Jewish tomb, but 3 days later, you and his other followers see Jesus alive just as he predicted. You touch him, eat with him, and he continues to perform miracles, the last being his ascension to heaven. 40 years later, your temple is destroyed just as Jesus had predicted. along with the entire city and thousands of your countrymen. Question: if you and your fellow followers write accounts of Jesus after the temple and city were destroyed in AD 70, aren't you going to at least mention the unprecedented national, human, economic, and religious tragedy somewhere in your writings, especially since the risen Jesus had predicted it? But they didn't, which means that the books were written before AD 70. Of course, you're going to mention the destruction of the temple if it happened before you wrote. Well, here's the problem for those who say that the New Testament was written after 70. There's absolutely no mention of the fulfillment of this predicted tragedy anywhere in the New Testament documents. That means the New Testament documents were written before the temple was destroyed. That means most, if not all, the documents must have been written prior to 70. Some may object that's an argument from silence. That doesn't prove anything. But in fact, it is not an argument from silence, for the New Testament documents speak of Jerusalem and the temple, or activities associated with them, as if they were still intact at the time of the writings. But even if this were an argument from silence, that doesn't mean it's wrong. Consider these modern parallels. If a former sailor aboard the USS Arizona wrote a book related to the history of that ship, and that book ends with no mention of the ship being sunk and 1,177 of its sailors being killed at Pearl Harbor, do you have any doubt that the book must have been written prior to the date that Pearl Harbor took place, 12/7/41? Or if a former tenant of the World Trade Center wrote a book to the history of the World Trade Center buildings, and the book ends with the towers still standing, there's absolutely no mention of the towers being destroyed and nearly 3,000 people being murdered by Muslim terrorists, do you have any doubt that the book must have been written prior to 9/11? Of course not. Well, the disaster in AD 70 in terms of lives, property, and national scope was many magnitudes greater than Pearl Harbor and 9/11. It marked the end of such a terrible war that Josephus, who himself surrendered to the Romans in 67, called it the greatest war of all time. The Jews didn't just lose one ship or a couple of prominent buildings. They lost their entire country, their capital city, their temple, which had been the center of their religious, political, and economic life for the last 1,000 years. In addition, tens of thousands of their countrymen were dead, and hundreds of their villages burned to the ground. So, if we would expect tragedies such as Pearl Harbor and 9/11 to be mentioned in the relevant writings of today, we certainly should expect the events of 70 AD to be cited somewhere in the New Testament, especially since the events were predicted by Jesus. But, since the New Testament does not mention these events anywhere and suggests that Jerusalem and the temple are still intact, we can conclude reasonably that most, if not all, of the New Testament documents must have been written prior to 70. How much earlier? Imagine this. You're a first-century medical doctor who's embarked on a research project to record the events of the early church. The research will require you to interview eyewitnesses of the early church and to travel with the Apostle Paul as he visits new churches across the ancient world. You record prominent events in the history of the church, such as the early work of John and Peter, as well as the martyrdom of Stephen and James, the brother of John. In Paul's life, you record everything from sermons, beatings, and trials to shipwrecks and imprisonments. You also record this theological summit with Peter and James, who's Jesus' brother and the leader of the church in Jerusalem. As you describe many of these events, your narrative's filled with details that every informed reader will know that either you must have access to eyewitness testimony or you are an eyewitness yourself. For example, as you follow Paul in his travels, you shift from using the pronoun they to we, and you correctly record the names of local business practices. You even record the right depth of water about a quarter mile off Malta as your ship is about to run aground in a storm. In fact, you record at least 84 such details in the last half of your narrative. Question: since you obviously find it important to record all these minor details, if your main subject, the Apostle Paul, was executed at the hands of the Roman Emperor Nero, do you think you would record it? Or, if Jesus' brother, the leader of the Jerusalem church, was killed at the hands of the same Sanhedrin, the same Jewish body that sentenced Jesus to die, do you think you would record it? Of course. And if you failed to record such momentous events, we would rightly assume you had written your narrative before their deaths. This is the situation we find in the New Testament. Luke, the medical doctor, meticulously records all kinds of details in Acts, which chronicles the early church. There are 84 historically confirmed details in the next chapter. I'm in the process of composing the notes for that presentation now, and it's amazing. Just the depth and breadth of the historical data that Luke records. Such a reliable eyewitness historian. Luke records the deaths of 2 Christian martyrs, Stephen and James, the brother of John, but his account ends with 2 of its primary leaders, Paul and James, the brother of Jesus, still living. Acts ends abruptly with Paul under house arrest in Rome, and there's no mention of James having died. We know from Clement of Rome, writing in the late 1st century, and from other early church fathers, that Paul was executed sometime during the reign of Nero, which ended in AD 68. And we know from Josephus that James was killed in AD 62. So we can conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that the book of Acts was written before 62. If you're still not convinced that Acts was written before 62, consider this modern parallel. Suppose someone wrote a book recording the events surrounding the main figures of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. The book begins with the assassination of President John F. Kennedy and includes the civil rights legislation of 1964, the marches and protests of Martin Luther King Jr., including his arrest and imprisonment, and his great I Have a Dream speech on the Mall in Washington, D.C. Question: if the book ends with Martin Luther King Jr., the very leader of the movement, still alive, when would you conclude the book was written? Obviously, before his assassination in April of 1968. This is the same situation we have in Luke's narrative. His book ends with the main leaders still alive, which means it was written no later than 62. Classical scholar and historian Colin Hemmer gives 13 additional reasons why Acts was written by 62. If Acts is written by 62, then Luke was written before 62. How do we know? Because Luke reminds the original recipient of Acts, Theophilus, who was probably an important Roman official, that he had written to him earlier. The first verse of Acts says, "In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach." The former book must have been Luke's Gospel, because Luke addresses that to Theophilus as well. How much earlier is Luke? It would be reasonable to place Luke at or before AD 60. Why would it be reasonable to place Luke at or before AD 60? Because 62 is the latest Acts was written, and there had to have been some time between Luke's first writing to Theophilus and his second. By the way, I believe Luke is the longest gospel of the 4 in terms of length. Luke has 24 chapters, Matthew has 28, but Luke had longer chapters. So, on a whole. So, so Acts came after the Gospels. So, he had to take time to write Acts and to go through those events that were contained in the book of Acts. So all that's going to take time too, which is going to make Acts take a long time to write as well. So Acts would have had to have come at the latest 62. So you're talking, there's got to be some interval between the end of Luke and the time that it took to write Acts. If Acts is no later than 62, and quite possibly earlier than 62, then Luke is realistically 60 or before. This date also makes sense in light of Paul's quotation of Luke's Gospel. Writing sometime between AD 62 to 65, Paul quotes from Luke 10:7 and calls it Scripture. Therefore, Luke's Gospel must have been in circulation long enough before that time in order for both Paul and Timothy to know its contents and regard it as Scripture. By the way, this was no minor claim for Paul to make. In effect, Paul was making the bold assertion that Luke's Gospel was just as inspired as the Holy Jewish Bible, the Old Testament that Paul treasured so much. If Luke was written by 60, then Mark must have been written in the mid to late 50s, if not earlier. Why? Because Luke says that he got his facts by checking with eyewitness sources. Here's how Luke begins. in chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. Many of us have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses of the servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good to me also to write an orderly account to you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that I have been taught, or the certainty of the things that you have been taught. Most scholars believe Mark's gospel was one of those eyewitness sources, and if those Dead Sea Scroll fragments we mentioned above are really from AD 50 to 70, then certainly Mark is earlier. But even if Mark is not before Luke, the very fact that we know beyond a reasonable doubt that Luke is before 62 and probably before 60, that we have meticulously recorded eyewitness testimony written within 25 to 30 years of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. This is far too early to be legendary. It also means that the eyewitness sources go back even earlier. How much earlier? Well, as certain as... So now we're going to talk about how some of the New Testament books were penned in the 40s and 50s with sources from the 30s, which are only a few years after the death of Jesus. As certain as we are about the date of Luke's records, there is no doubt from anyone, including the most liberal scholars, that Paul wrote his first letter to the Church of Corinth, which is in modern-day Greece, sometime between 55 and 56. In this letter, Paul speaks about moral problems in the church and then proceeds to discuss controversies over tongues, prophecies, and the Lord's Supper. This, of course, demonstrates that the church in Corinth was experiencing some kind of miraculous activity and was already observing the Lord's Supper within 25 years of the resurrection. But the most significant aspect of this letter is that it contains the earliest and most authenticated testimony of the resurrection itself. In the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians, Paul writes down the testimony he received from others and the testimony that was authenticated when Christ appeared to him. In 1 Corinthians 15:3 through 8, I delivered to you, first of all, that which I also received, Paul writes, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, that he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12, and that he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. And after that he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. Then, last of all, he was seen by me also, as by one born out of due time. Where did Paul get what he received? He probably received it from Peter and James when he visited them in Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion, according to Galatians chapter 1. Why is this important? Because, as Gary Habermas points out, most scholars, even liberal scholars, believe that this testimony was part of an early creed that dates right back to the resurrection itself, 18 months to 8 years earlier, but some say 18 months to 8 years after, but some say even earlier. There's no possible way that such testimony could describe a legend, because it goes back to the right time and the right place of the event itself. If there was ever a place that a legendary resurrection could not occur, it was in Jerusalem, because the Jews and the Romans were all too eager to squash Christianity and could have easily done so by parading Jesus' body around the city. Very easy way to get the resurrection narrative to stop being passed around. Just, where's Jesus' body? I think I said that multiple times in discussing the skeptical responses to the evidence for the resurrection. Moreover, notice that Paul cites 14 eyewitnesses whose names are known. He cites the 12 apostles, James, Paul himself. Cephas is the Aramaic word for Peter, and then Paul references an appearance to more than 500 others at one time. Including in the groups was one skeptic, James, and one outright enemy, Paul himself. By naming so many people who could verify what Paul was saying, Paul was, in effect, challenging his Corinthian readers to check him out. Bible scholar William Lilly puts it this way, quote, "What gives a special authority to the list as historical evidence is the reference to most of the 500 brethren as still being alive." St. Paul says, in effect, if you do not believe me, you can ask them. Such a statement in an admittedly genuine letter written within 30 years of the event is almost as strong evidence as one could hope to get for something that happened nearly 2,000 years ago, end quote. If the resurrection had not occurred, why would Paul give such a list of supposed eyewitnesses? He would have immediately lost all credibility with his Corinthian readers by lying so blatantly. In addition to 1 Corinthians, there are numerous other New Testament documents that were written in the 50s or earlier. Galatians was written in AD 48, 1 Thessalonians was written in 50 to 54, somewhere in there, and Romans was written in 57 to 58, somewhere in there. Those are the New Testament documents that were written in the 50s or earlier. In fact, and we know we may be going out on a limb here, all of Paul's works, yeah, this is sarcasm. We know he may be going out on a limb here, but all of Paul's works had to have been written before he died, which was sometime in the mid AD 60s. He's not going to be writing after he's dead. But it's not just conservative scholars who believe those early dates. Even some radical critics, such as John A.T. Robinson, admit the New Testament documents were written early. Let's see. Known for his role in launching the Death of God movement, Robinson wrote a revolutionary book titled Redating the New Testament, in which he posited most of the New Testament books, including all 4 Gospels, were written sometime between 40 and 65. The great and once liberal archaeologist William F. Albright, after seeing how well the New Testament fit with the archaeological and historical data, wrote, "We can already say emphatically that there is no longer any solid basis for dating any book of the New Testament after about AD 80. Elsewhere, Albright said, "In my opinion, every book of the New Testament was written by a baptized Jew between the 40s and 80s of the first century, very probably sometime about AD 50 and 75. So we know beyond a reasonable doubt that most, if not all, the New Testament documents are early, but skeptics still have a couple of objections. So let's play skeptic's advocate. The documents are not early enough. Some skeptics may think that a 15 to 40 year gap between the life of Christ and the writings about Christ is too wide for the testimony to be reliable, but skeptics are mistaken. Think about events that occurred 15 to 40 years ago. When historians write about those events, we don't say, "Oh, that's impossible." No one can remember events from that long ago. Such skepticism is clearly unwarranted. Historians today write accurately about events in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And remember, this book was published in 2004, so we're talking about events that were written 15, 25, 35 years ago, by consulting their own memories, those of other eyewitnesses, and any written sources from that time. This process is the same one the New Testament writers used to record their documents. Like a good reporter, Luke interviewed eyewitnesses. As we'll see in the next chapter, some New Testament writers were eyewitnesses themselves. They could remember 15 to 40-year-old events quite easily, just as you can. Why can you remember certain events vividly from 15 to 40 years ago if you're old enough, and if you're old enough, even further back? You may be able to remember certain events because they made a great emotional impact on you. In fact, those of us who were over the hill can remember some events from 30 years ago better than from 30 minutes ago. Where were you and what were you doing when JFK was assassinated in 1963? Where were you when the Challenger space shuttle exploded in 1986? Where were you when the second plane hit the towers in 9/11 and 2001? Again, this book was published in 2004, so I'm trying to think of, and I'm 41 years old, so I'm trying to think of an event in my lifetime that came after 2001 that is historically significant like that. But at the moment, I can't think of one. Why can you remember events like that so well? Because they've made a deep emotional impact on you. Since an event like the resurrection certainly would have made a deep emotional impact on the New Testament writers and the other eyewitnesses they consulted, it's easy to see why the history of Jesus could be easily recalled many years later, especially in a culture with established reliance on oral testimony. There's going to be more on that later. Furthermore, if the major works of the New Testament are eyewitness accounts written within 2 generations of the events, they are not likely to be legend. Why? Because historical research indicates that a myth or a legend cannot begin to crowd out historical facts while the eyewitnesses are still alive. For this reason, Roman historian A.N. Sherwin-White calls the mythological view of the New Testament unbelievable. William Lane Craig writes, the tests show that even 2 generations is too short to allow tendencies to wipe out the hardcore historical fact. Inside of those 2 generations, eyewitnesses are still around to correct the errors of historical revisionists. Right, so if people are... So you have to recreate the story after all the eyewitnesses, after all the people who were alive during the events have died. You have to wait to redo the story until after all the witnesses have died. Because if you're trying to recreate the story and put a whole bunch of errors in the story, if the living witnesses catch wind of you doing that, they're gonna correct you. We're seeing this tendency right now with regard to the Holocaust. Of course, by now, those people have died. In the early 21st century, we've begun to see more people claim the Holocaust never happened. Why are the revisionists trying this now? Because most of the eyewitnesses have died. Fortunately, since we have written testimony from the Holocaust, the revisionists are not successful in passing off their lies as the truth. The same holds true for the New Testament. If the New Testament was written within 60 years of the events it records, it's highly unlikely those events could be legendary. And as we've seen, all the New Testament documents were written within 60 years of the events, and many much earlier. Why not earlier than within 60 years? At this point, a skeptic might say, okay, fine, the New Testament's early, but it's still not as early as I would expect. Why didn't they write down their testimony earlier? If I saw what they said they saw, I wouldn't wait 15 or 20 years to write it down. There are a number of possible reasons for the wait. First, since the New Testament writers were living in a culture where the vast majority of people were illiterate, there was no initial need or utility in writing it down. First century people in Palestine, by necessity, developed stronger memories in order to remember and pass on information. William Lane Craig writes, quote, in an oral culture like that of the first century Palestine, the ability to memorize and recall large tracts of oral tradition was a highly prized and highly developed skill. From the earliest age, children in the home, elementary school, and synagogue were taught to memorize faithfully sacred tradition. The disciples would have exercised similar care with the teachings of Jesus, end quote. In such an oral culture, facts about Jesus may have been put into a memorable form. There's good evidence for this. Gary Habermas has identified 41 short sections of the New Testament that appear to be creeds, compact sayings that could easily be remembered and that were probably passed along orally before they were put into writing. One of these creeds we've already mentioned from 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Second, since some of the New Testament writers may have had high hopes that Jesus was going to come back in their lifetime, they saw no immediate need to write it down. But as they aged, perhaps they thought it wise to put their observations down on papyrus. Third, as Christianity spread all over the ancient world, writing became the most efficient means to communicate with the rapidly expanding church. In other words, time and distance forced the New Testament writers to write it down. On the other hand, there may not have been a gap for at least one gospel. If those fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls are really from Mark, and they most likely are, then that gospel may have been written in the 30s. Why? Because the fragments are of copies. The fragments are not of the original. If we have copies from the 50s, then the original must have been written earlier. Moreover, many scholars believe that there actually were written sources that predate the Gospels. In fact, Luke, in the first 4 verses of his Gospel, says that he checked with other sources, though some of these may have been earlier Gospels, like Matthew or Mark. Was one of Luke's sources Mark's Gospel? We don't know for sure. It certainly seems like Luke is speaking of several other written sources, because he says many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. Luke may have referenced Mark's gospel and other written testimonies, including public court records from Jesus' trial. In the end, it doesn't really matter whether or not there were written sources that predate the New Testament, nor does it matter if Mark was written in the 30s AD. Why? Because the documents we do know about are early enough and contain early source material. As we'll see in the next chapter, many, if not all, the New Testament documents are written by eyewitnesses or their contemporaries within 50 to 40 years of Jesus, and some contain oral and or other written testimony that goes back to the resurrection itself. In other words, the real issue isn't so much the date of the writings, but the date of the sources used in the writings. So why not more? Skeptics may ask, if Jesus actually did rise from the dead, shouldn't there be more written about him than there is? In response, we actually have more testimony than we might expect, and certainly more than enough to establish beyond a reasonable doubt what happened. As we've seen, Jesus is referenced by far more authors than the Roman emperor at the time. Jesus' 43 authors to Tiberius's As we've seen, Jesus is referenced by far more authors than the Roman emperor at the time. Jesus' 43 authors to Tiberius's 10 within 150 years of their lives. Nine of those authors were eyewitnesses or contemporaries of the events. They wrote 27 documents, the majority of which mention or imply the resurrection. That's more than enough to establish her historicity. For those who still think there should have been even more written about Jesus, New Testament scholar Craig Blomberg offers 4 reasons why that's not a reasonable explanation. The humble beginnings of Christianity, the remote location of Palestine on the eastern frontiers of the Roman Empire, a small percentage of the works of ancient Greco-Roman historians that have survived. This could be due to loss, decay, destruction, or all the above, and the lack of attention paid by surviving historical documents to Jewish figures in general. Nevertheless, some skeptics think there should be testimony from some of the 500 people who allegedly saw the risen Christ. Skeptic Farrell Till is one of them. During a debate on the resurrection that Geisler had with Till in 1994, Till demanded, trot out one of those 500 witnesses or give us something that they wrote, and we will accept that as reliable proof or evidence. This is an unreasonable expectation for a number of reasons. First, as we've already pointed out, first century Palestine was an oral culture. Most people were illiterate and remembered and passed on information orally. Second, how many of those predominantly illiterate eyewitnesses would have written something even if they could write? Even today, with a much higher literacy rate and all the conveniences of modern writing and research tools, how many people do you know who've written a book or an article on any subject? How many do you know who have written a book or an article on a contemporary historical event, even a significant event like 9/11? Probably not many, and certainly fewer than 1 out of 500. Has Farrell Till ever written an article on a major historical event he witnessed? Third, if some of those 500 average people did write down what they saw, why would the skeptics expect their testimony to survive 2,000 years? The New Testament survives intact because of thousands of manuscripts copied by scribes for a growing church over the centuries. Historical works from the major ancient historians such as Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny survive on just a handful of copies, and those copies are hundreds of years from the originals. Why do the skeptics think anything is going to be written, much less survive, from an ancient group of illiterate Galilean peasants? Finally, we do know the names of many of the 500 and their testimonies written down in the New Testament. They include Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, James, plus the 9 who are mentioned elsewhere as apostles in Matthew 10 and Acts 1. So we shouldn't expect more testimony than what we have about Jesus. And what we do have is more than enough to establish historicity. You know, that knowing the names of many of the 500, a skeptic heard one of these videos and sent me a private comment and asked to provide who the eyewitnesses were. This was the answer to that skeptic's question, but he's probably not going to go back and listen to the rest of these videos to get it. So now we're to the summary and conclusion of this chapter. We have much more to investigate regarding the historicity of the New Testament. but we can draw two major conclusions at this point. We have an accurate copy of the original New Testament documents. While the original New Testament documents do not survive or have not been found yet, we have abundant and accurate copies of the original New Testament documents, many more than for the 10 best pieces of ancient literature combined. Moreover, nearly perfect reconstruction of the originals can be accomplished by comparing the thousands of manuscripts that do survive. We have discovered manuscript fragments from the early 2nd century and perhaps as early as the mid-1st century. There are no works from the ancient world today that even come close to the New Testament in terms of manuscript support. Reconstruction is further authenticated by the thousands of quotations from the early Church Fathers. In fact, the entire New Testament, except for 11 verses, can be reconstructed just from the quotations from the early Church Fathers. That, to me, is remarkable. The New Testament documents are early and contain even earlier source material. Since the New Testament documents are referenced by other writers by about AD 100, they had to have been composed before AD 100. Since the New Testament documents speak as if the temple and the city were still standing at the time of their writing, and there is no mention of the onset of the Jewish war and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, most of the New Testament documents are probably earlier than AD 70. We have very strong evidence that Acts was written by AD 62, which means that Luke is even earlier. We have the source material that goes back into the 30s. Nearly all scholars agree that the death, burial, and resurrection testimony found in 1 Corinthians 15 comes from the time of those events or within a few years of them. Furthermore, there are at least 40 other creeds in the New Testament that appear to be of very early origin. So the documents are early and the sources are even earlier. But that's not enough to prove historicity beyond a reasonable doubt. To prove historicity, we need to be sure that these documents really contain eyewitness testimony. Do they? That's the question we'll investigate next. Do we have eyewitness testimony about Jesus? That'll be in the next chapter. I'm composing that chapter right now, and it's got some remarkable stuff. They list stuff from the book of Acts and how Luke, the meticulous historian that Luke is, records details that would be, if you really think about it, they would be really, really, really hard for somebody to just make up. They're going to have to be details that only an accurate historian would know. And he must have taken the care to record those details so that people could trust the accuracy of his report. So anyway, thank you for tuning into this installment of Blessed Man Meditations. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please consider supporting my ministry by purchasing my published work, and I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.